Perfectionism doesn't exist in a vacuum within us. It's a social phenomenon. The only way that which we can understand or know that we've done something well or we've done something perfectly is when we compare it with what's happening in the outside world, or that we're given validation or approval to tell us it's okay. And if we don't receive that approval or that validation, then that is a signal to us that we're not good enough, that we are flawed. That very focus on growth doesn't allow us to accept that in this moment we're okay, we're good enough. This kind of incomprehensible miracle that is our existence should mean that just existing means we're enough.
Yes.
The growth mindset really kind of denies us that, or something that's quite beautiful about that kind of realization, because it always teaches us that there's always more to do.
Hello and welcome to the Life Lessons podcast with me, Simon Mundie. This podcast has a simple mission: to have discussions that reveal something important about life and how best to live it. My guests range from the biggest sporting names on the planet through to neuroscientists, philosophers, psychologists, and world-renowned thinkers. We talk about things like how to skillfully relate to uncomfortable thoughts and feelings, the power of acceptance and psychological flexibility, how to get your circadian rhythms in sync to feel your best, right through to the nature of reality. These conversations and the bite-sized episodes have the power to change your life.
Tom Curran, absolutely lovely to see you. How are you?
Thanks, Simon. I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm not too bad. Little rushed, as you know, what with babies and whatever else, but delighted to be with you. And I have to say, I chuckled to myself, right? Because obviously, when I record a podcast, I have a start time, and I had a little bet with myself. I bet you'll be early. And you were. I could see you loading up 3 minutes early. And that is in no way a surprise, is it? Because you're a recovering perfectionist, as outlined in your fantastic book, The Perfection Trap. So first things first, thanks for being early/on time. And secondly, congratulations on what is a fascinating bit of work.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I hope people enjoy it. I have to say, as a recovering perfectionist, it wasn't the easiest process to actually write, and I think by the end of it, my editor was ready to throttle me because I was still trying to make changes just before we go to print. But we got there in the end, and I'm really pleased with it.
Yeah, I was going to ask how the process was as someone who has perfectionist tendencies, and I can relate to this. Um, it's torturous at the best of not at the best of times. Let's say at the worst of times, writing a book. So, with those tendencies, how painful did it get?
Well, let's put it this way. One of the things that's really tough for a perfectionist is to kind of write something, think you've done it reasonably well, read it back at the time, think that's okay, go back 2 days later, read it again, and think, oh my goodness me, who wrote that?
I resonate.
That is absolutely terrible. So you delete the whole thing, you start again, and rinse, repeat. And that's why this process can be lengthy for the perfectionists, because everything they do, and I include myself in this, is never quite good enough. And when you come back to it, you feel like it could be made better. So you constantly tinker, iterate, change, edit, and it takes a long time.
It certainly does. Yes, I can relate to that fully. Now, I think I said to you just before we started recording how eager I was to get you on, because I think the message that you are talking about in The Perfection Trap, the power of good enough in a world that always wants more, fabulous subheading, is so called for at this moment in time. There's so much emphasis on being your best self, that old saying, and hustling and striving to get to the very top of the tree and all that kind of stuff, which I think is pretty corrosive to the soul. And that seems to be something that resonates with you too.
Absolutely. I think we live in an age where nothing we ever do is ever good enough, because there's always something more. And success is a bit of a bottomless pit that depletes us in its pursuit. And I describe it in the book a bit like trying to chase the horizon.
Yes.
The closer we get, the further it gets away from us. And this is kind of what it's like to live in modern society. Now, I want to reiterate, and I think your listeners is really important to recognize that this is by design. The economy spins on an axis which is dependent upon consumption and work. Right, we need to be constantly doing those two things in order for our economy to grow, and so it's quite natural and understandable for us to be held in a kind of holding pattern of not necessarily discontent, but certainly disquiet about our existing life circumstances,
Mm.
so that we keep consuming, so that we keep working to try to better ourselves. However, I think my book is really a kind of call to take another look at that particular way of living and try to maybe forge within that society a more contented and peaceful existence.
Yeah, to see through that trap, like you say, it's that consistent pursuit of more. I mean, advertising, as we know, for example, if you're associated with a famous person or even a dead famous person or a young, attractive person, the implication being have this product, you will be more like that. Of
Mm,
course, though, that's utter baloney. And we'll come to that kind of deeper structural societal side of things. But I want to really sort of start with you because you are a recovering perfectionist, which you describe yourself as, and I suppose it's a journey that never ends in many ways. Can we just talk a bit about how that manifested in your life? Because I know, for example, in the book you talk about there was a breakup that you went through, a particularly painful breakup, and rather than sharing it, you bottled it up. That then also led to separately, but also combined, while you're at university, just working obscenely long hours, and all of this eventually just the top blew off to a degree, and
mm,
finally you sought help and were given this diagnosis, as it were, that the stem of a significant chunk of your problems and self-induced stress was coming from perfectionism. So can you just talk about your own personal journey, because they do say research is me search, don't they?
absolutely. And I really wanted in the book to be quite open about my own experiences of perfectionism, my own background, because I think social science books written by social scientists in the academic field can sometimes miss information about where people are coming from, the lens of which they view the world. Social science is not a hard and fixed science. It's not biology. It's not physics. We do social research, and we can do the most rigorous research we can possibly do, but we still have to interpret that data in ways that align with our belief systems. And I want people to be upfront and understand that this is where I come from. And so my experiences of perfectionism really shaped the way that I see perfectionism. And as you mentioned, one of the things throughout my young adult life that became a really difficulty for me was dealing with my perfection, dealing with those excessive pressure to excel at all times, which works to a certain extent, but then when things go wrong, as you mentioned, I describe in the book a particularly difficult situation with a partner. That's when things start to snowball, and a trigger can then can kind of spread into all spheres of our life and impact how we think, feel. We begin to become depressed, anxious, low mood, which then we use more perfectionism, ironically, to try to drive through those issues because we think, and this is very common for perfectionists, we think perfectionism is the one thing when everything and all around us is kind of collapsing, right? Is the one thing holding us up in the world. But we need to recognize that often it's actually the perfectionism itself that's creating those problems. And if we can address the perfectionism, then the power of those sort of anxiety or depressive feelings will melt away. So for me, that's the biggest thing. If there's one biggest thing that I want people to get from the book, is kind of push through that myth about perfectionism being something that holds us up. It's really
Yeah.
something that creates a lot of distress.
Just briefly, tell me about that eureka moment then when the therapist said perfectionism.
Well, it was difficult at first because you fight against it. People who are perfectionists, they kind of think that they kind of disguise their pain behind a kind of sense of hyper functioning, maximization. And so you really want to fight back against that. But, a skillful therapist is able to kind of peel away those thoughts, those feelings, those behaviors. They're able to show you how actually, rather than helping you, they're creating a lot of conflict in your life, a lot of rumination and brooding and stress, which is creating a lot of exhaustion and burnout. And over time, you kind of get to this point where you are able to see very clearly, actually, yeah, Like this pressure that I'm putting myself through, far from helping me, is really holding me back. And that from that moment on, really, it was I was already in the academic system, but it was something that I thought, well, I need to look into this more, because I think we misunderstand this thing a lot in modern culture. And the more you delve into the research, the more you do the research, the more you find out, the more you can see quite clearly how perfectionism really, really does create a lot of problems for people.
And yet it is society's favorite flaw. I think you give the example, don't you, of that classic job interview question, what's your biggest weakness? Well, I'm a perfectionist. And it's like, hey, great, you're hired, So it's still put on something of a pedestal.
Absolutely. We definitely celebrate perfectionism in today's society. And I see that my students kind of racked with perfectionism, but they genuinely think it's the thing that's made them successful. And you work with them and you try to say, there are more healthier ways to strive, like conscientiousness, being diligent and persevering, meticulousness when it's needed, and all these great things that aren't perfectionism, very different to perfectionism. But still, there's a sense that, but I have to be perfect. Like, I'm not going to succeed in this world if I'm not perfect. It's really competitive out there. There are so many people who I'm competing against. And this isn't just at elite universities. You see this all over the place, in the workplace, in just general society. When we talked earlier about consumer culture and how social media in particular, how we're very much placed against each other on a kind of social hierarchy, and it can feel impossible because everybody else seems to be perfect, right? So I think very much it's the case that we radiate perfection as a culture. That really is internalized by people. Our culture radiates perfection, so we radiate too.
And rather than celebrating perfectionism, it is fundamentally a form of neuroticism, isn't it? And it leads to, as you've already mentioned, a lack of balance, to burnout, to depression, to anxiety, all these things.
Yeah, it's definitely highly correlated with neuroticism. It does create a lot of worry, as I say, rumination about how we're doing relative to other people, a hypervigilance of other people's performances relative to our own. Perfectionists can be really competitive people. Yeah, so it's definitely something I think we misunderstand. It's not to say that we can't have high standards or we can't
Yes.
be aspirational. This isn't what I'm saying. But what I am saying is this kind of need, this neurotic, as you mentioned, as you described, neurotic desire to be perfect is something that we've kind of mistakenly believe is necessary for success, when actually it's not the case.
Yeah, you talked about just then perfectionism not being equated with high standards. And in the book, I think it's your grandfather, isn't it, who was correct me if I'm wrong, he made woodwork stuff or
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah.
But he wasn't a perfectionist. He just had high standards. He didn't need it to be validated. He was like, okay, I'm creating to the level that I'm content with, and then would put it out and move on. So there is this fundamental difference between high standards and perfectionism. So how would you, clearly define that for someone listening so that they can really make that distinction?
This is so important, Simon. So, and I think this is one of the biggest myths that kind of pervade about perfectionism. This idea perfectionism is high standards. I'm a perfectionist because I define myself by the high standards I set for myself. Well, that's only half the story, because there are many people out there who also have high standards but aren't perfectionists. And the example I give is my grandfather, because when I think back to spending time with grandfather, he was a master carpenter, very famous in the local area, still has his work in a number of pubs, which is amazing because you can go back to these places and see your grandfather like work. It's almost like he's still there, sort of thing. But an incredible individual, hugely high standards, meticulous, but not a perfectionist, because he would make these things. He would make everyday things that people needed, and he'd take them out of his workshop to the place where they're going to be installed, and he would just leave them there. He wouldn't loiter for approval. He wouldn't wait for a 5-star rating. He wouldn't put it on Instagram and hope people give him fire emojis. None of these things mattered in his world. And if he made a mistake, if he missed a bit of varnish, if he left the screw tip jutting imperceptibly out of the wood, he would just let those mistakes wash through him as sure a sign of his imperfection or his inherent fallibility as his sciatica or wrinkles. Like, these things were not massive issues for him because he was able to see the bigger picture. that he was making things that people needed and used and enjoyed. And that is a sign and a mark of someone who's got high standards and is able to see satisfaction in what he's created. The perfectionist is singly unable to do that. They worry, they ruminate, they need other people's approval, they need that validation in order to soothe the fear of not being good enough. And that's a very different thing to someone like my grandfather, who just had very high standards and was an excellent person in his vocation.
It sounds like he understood clearly that perfection on the level of form, is impossible. It's an illusion. And you talked then about he didn't seek approval. He didn't need approval. He didn't need the 5-star ratings. And the link then between perfectionism and external approval is clearly extremely high. And that reminds me of you talking about your TED talk, where you've spoken about your leg wobbling and wanting everyone to give you a standing ovation and everything like that. And I think so many people could resonate with that. Is, when we do something, whether it be write a book, give a talk, whatever it may be, piece of work, instead of it being, okay, we're the ones who will decide whether it's good enough, it's no, we need that validation externally, and that is fundamentally linked with perfectionism.
Oh, it's you cannot. Perfectionism it doesn't exist in a vacuum within us. It's a social phenomenon. It's something that has a heavy social strain. That's to say that the only way that which we can understand or know that we've done something well or we've done something perfectly is when we compare it with what's happening in the outside world, or that we're given validation or approval to tell us it's okay, that was good. And if we don't receive that approval or that validation, then that is a signal to us that we're not good enough, that we are flawed, and that those things we know deep down about ourselves that we don't want other people to know, well, they've just been exposed because I haven't received the praise or whatever that I was expecting to receive. And this is the same with the TED Talk. TED's really interesting, and this audience have a subtle way of telling you whether they liked it or whether they thought it was just okay. And if they liked it, it was a standing ovation, raucous applause. And if it was just okay, it was a very polite, seated applause. So, instantly as soon as you finish the talk, whether it was like a rousing speech or whether it's just, run of the mill. And for a perfectionist like me, there's a kind of sense that I needed that approval from the audience to tell me that, yeah, this was a good talk, because if I didn't get that, then I would instantly go in on myself and think that I did a really bad job. And that's what happened. And I tell that story because I think, a lot of people can resonate with the sense that it's the external validation and approval that we're so desperately in need of. And when it doesn't arrive, that can make us feel really, really bad about ourselves. And that's a very strong signal of a perfectionist.
And that seeking validation, that seeking approval, that also is a bottomless pit. If you talk about that horizon, isn't it? It's like a dopamine hit. We have to keep coming back for more and more and more. There will never be a time when, okay, I got just enough approval on this occasion. That's filled me up and I won't need approval again. It doesn't work like that at all. And that comes back to this, and you've alluded to it just there, this core belief underpinning perfectionism, it sounds like, from reading your work, which is, I'm not enough. This fundamental shame, core belief that I'm not good enough, that I think is in all of us to a certain degree. It's almost inevitable as we grow up, isn't it? But but obviously when it comes to perfectionism, it's really driving everything.
It's really strong. And you're absolutely right with the approval piece. The better we do, the better we feel like we're expected to do. This is why it's like a treadmill, right? It's never ever enough, because you can do the most amazing performance, you can have the most amazing success, and then there's something else that needs to be done, and you feel like, and this is very classic of the profession, you feel like, okay, well, now I've set the bar here, so everyone else is going to expect me to keep being here, and so I'm going to have to set goals that are higher than here, so I can make sure that I'm living up to the expectation that people have of me. So again, like, it goes back to this kind of unrelenting sense that we're just never quite good enough ever. This goes on forever because the circle can't be closed. And I think that's the approval piece, the other people's validation piece, is a really important piece of that. because it is other people's approval that we're forever chasing and that we don't think we'll ever quite reach. So, for me, it's really important that people see perfectionism not just as kind of this, oh, I have perfect standards for myself, but actually I have perfect standards for myself because I'm in need of other people's approval, if that makes sense.
Yeah, of course. Which brings us then to, two of the stars of your book. So Paul Hewitt and Gord Flett. And they've come up with three types of perfectionist, which you outline. So can you to summarize, self-orientated, other-orientated, and socially prescribed. So could you just quickly, let's just rattle through them one by one. So self-orientated.
So self-orientated is kind of what most people would think about when they think about perfectionism, the kind of quintessential overstriver. It's high and excessive standards for ourselves, which is fused to harsh self-criticism when we haven't met those standards. But Paul and Gord have done a lot of work in this area over decades, and they've spoken to hundreds of perfectionists. And one of the things they learned was that perfectionism wasn't just this kind of self-set standards. Perfectionists also had a belief system about the world around them, which included a sense that other people expect me to be perfect. So this is socially prescribed perfectionism. This is a sense that other people in the external environment expect perfection of me, and they're judging me really harshly when I haven't been perfect. And the third element that they noticed in perfectionistic people was perfectionism that's turned outwards onto others. So not only do we have high standards, we also think that other people expect high standards of us, but we also expect high standards of other people. So I turn my perfectionism onto you, and if you haven't been perfect or you haven't lived up to a certain standard that I expect, then I'll let you know. And this is other-oriented perfectionism. And so people can be, higher or lower on one or the other. Like nobody is like kind of high on all of them. Some people are higher on self-oriented, a bit lower on other-oriented, maybe in the middle of socially prescribed. We all kind of have our unique constellation. This is the most interesting thing about perfection. Really, there's no one size fits all. But these are the three key sort of dimensions of perfectionism that they see within people, and they've kind of been the basis for much of the research in this area. These are the three key sort of dimensions of perfectionism that they see within people, and they've kind of been the basis for much of the research in this area.
And I know you scored highly on two of them, right?
Yeah, so I don't see myself much as an other-oriented perfectionist, but I do have a lot of self-imposed pressure, and I feel a lot of pressure from the outside world. So I would sound quite high on self, quite high on social, a little bit low on other. That's not to say I haven't found myself in the trap of expecting high standards of other people. I absolutely have in the past, but it's not a dominant form of my perfectionism. The other two are much greater.
I know you talk about socially prescribed perfectionism just being on the rise, and you've equated it to around the year, I think, 2005. And I thought it was interesting that you give a nod to Jean Twenge, I think is how you pronounce it. And I'm sure you're aware of the work of Professor Cal Newport. And I had Cal on the pod a while back, and we spoke about like digital minimalism and this kind of thing, and he talked about iGen, in particular, the group of students who went to, in America, for example, high school, at just the time when there was a tipping point in terms of the amount of people who had smartphones and a social media account. And at that exact juncture, things like anxiety, well, in particular anxiety, in particular amongst girls, just absolutely went through the roof. And it was self-reported as well. It wasn't just like, okay, hang on, have we got the variables wrong? It was like, no, just ask them. And they were saying it's these things. The phone that I'm holding in my hand right now, that are driving us up the bend. So yeah, can you just talk to this third, the socially prescribed rise of perfectionism, and how you see that to have come into existence and the implications of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there has to be a massive role for social media in all of this. I think I would be remiss if I didn't dedicate a chapter to it in my book, and I did. I think Jean Twenge's work is excellent, very clear in her analyses, and what she finds is some actually quite horrifying
Mm.
results in terms of the implications for smartphone use on mental health. In the book, I think I take a little bit of a deeper dive into that relationship and go a little bit further than just smartphones and just platform apps like Instagram and TikTok. I try to investigate or interrogate the kind of economic framework in which those platforms were built. But beyond that, that would be the only difference between mine and her thinking. I think we're both on the same page. At these, social media is definitely instilling in young people a sense of dependency on likes, shares, mentions, kind of digital validation tokens, so to speak, for their self-esteem. And this, for me, is creating a lot of problems in terms of their sense of self-worth and how they perceive other people, and they've internalized those standards as kind of perfectionistic standards, and we're seeing that in the data, particularly in rising socially prescribed perfectionism, which is some of the data that I've analyzed, which is exploding exponentially right now. So there's definitely a case that socially prescribed perfectionism is rising because of the ubiquity of smartphones and the ubiquity of social media platforms that kind of project perfection as 24/7.
A few other things that I found really interesting that I want to talk about before we sort of dive in towards the end in terms of some of the solutions, if you like, and some of the answers. So we spoke at the beginning about how perfectionism is typically or often seen as this desirable trait. There are certain other things as well that have just been not really questioned. So, for example, people talking about their best self, but also things like grit. And then I found very interesting growth mindset. Now, I've spoken about growth mindset a few times, and I interviewed someone about it. I spoke to Carol Dweck a while back,
Yeah.
and I found that my own view of it has really evolved. And I spoke to a chap who sort of tried to replicate some of the research here in the UK. And he's like, look, it just doesn't stand up to scrutiny. And he came out with this quite interesting line, which was something like 80% of teachers who believe in the power of growth mindset is the same number, so 80%, who actually don't know how to implement it and get any benefit from it. So my own view of it is that it's massively overhyped and potentially even somewhat destructive. So I was interested to read that you're not a huge growth mindset advocate yourself.
I'm not, Simon. I've always been uneasy. So if you're a social psychologist, and you're going through the academic system, at some point you'll be met with the sort of growth mindset, the coward where fixed and incremental mindsets, which essentially kind of differentiate between two types of mindsets. One that's kind of very rigid and focused on outcomes. One that's focused on development and learning in a very basic sense. And everyone's very enamored with this approach, and I've always been a little bit uneasy with it for no other reason than really I don't want my mind to be set on anything, irrespective of if it's healthy or whatever. I want some flexibility to be able to have times when I'm low, times when I'm
Yeah.
down, times when I'm actually regressing, times when I'm standing still, and yes, times when I'm growing. But the kind of rigidity of that, what we call a mindset, is always struck me as kind of uneasy. But beyond that, one of the things that I think is I think we have to be aware with the growth mindset is it can easily turn over into an obsession with things like excellence, which can turn over into an obsession with perfection. And why do I say that? Well, we're often told, aren't we, you can't let your failures, your setbacks, things that go wrong define you. You have to let them teach you. You have to always essentially take those failures, setbacks, and rehabilitate them in some way
Yeah.
on the redemptive arc of growth
Yeah.
or excellence. Now, I have a problem with this because what that tells us is something that's a little bit unhuman. And that's that actually we shouldn't let those failures, setbacks sit with us for a little bit. That we have to immediately recycle them into something else, anything else that isn't the failure. And I think as humans, we are flawed, imperfect, exhaustible creatures. Deep down, we do know that. And if we're constantly told that we have to do something else with those failures and setbacks, as to say, recycle them, rehabilitate them, rather than just let them in and accept them as part of our common humanity, I think there's something also deeply unhuman about kind of this constant strive for growth.
Yeah.
And left unchecked, over time, one of the things I'm trying to argue in the book is essentially that can growth and more growth and more growth and more growth can lead to perfectionism, because it kind of denies us the psychological realities of other types of being that aren't always us moving in a forward direction, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And the implication is, isn't it, is that, if we've always got to be better, if we've always got to improve, is that we're not okay now. So the implicit message is that, you can't be satisfied with yourself because there's always room for improvement. And of course, there is room for improvement. But at the same time, it's like that old Zen saying, you're perfect as you are, but there's always room for a little bit of an improvement. And it is that sort of that middle ground. And just about growth mindset quickly again, I really like what you said there around, allowing room for change, because, what is a mindset other than a way of thinking? And clearly, like thoughts, the mind, by its very nature, is always changing. I know from my own experience, sometimes I'm like, God, I'm doing really well. And other times it's like, God, I'm really messing up, and I can apply that to any area of my life. Is that thoughts, by their very nature, whether they're about myself, about other people, they're up, they're down. And so this idea that you can pin it down into one area and really hone that, first, I think is just totally an inaccurate representation of reality. And again, is harmful in suggesting that, well, no, you're not okay if you're not allowing for this kind of up and down nature of mind, which is its very nature.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. This idea that very focus on growth doesn't allow us to accept that in this moment we're okay, we're good enough. That we exist, we live on this planet. This kind of incomprehensible miracle that is our existence should mean that just existing means we're enough.
Yes.
The growth mindset really kind of denies us that, or something that's quite beautiful about that kind of realization, because it always teaches us that there's always more to do. And I want to be clear on this, and you're absolutely right too, to add in the caveat that it isn't about not wanting to move forward, but human growth, real growth, is about accepting that there is a place you want to go, a destination. I think Carl Rogers put it beautifully when he said, I am at my greatest when I am pursuing goals to which I am dimly aware, moving in a more or less forward direction, but letting life wash over me.
Yeah.
And I think that's so important, because it doesn't mean you can't want to be in a certain place, you can't be aspirational, you can't try. It just means that at the same time, it's okay to accept that not everything's going to go to plan, and that's okay. We're still enough. We exist. We put one foot in front of the other. We go again next time. And I think that's, for me anyway, that's really helped me break through my perfectionism. Just accepting that things are not going to always turn out in the way that I hoped or expected they would, and that's okay. You can live next to that, sit comfortably next to that. We can move on. We can go again next time.
Absolutely. We're going to experience challenges, tragedy, disappointments. That's the very nature of life. And we're far less in control than we think we are. And then you said something which I think is absolutely fundamental a minute ago, which is this idea of, or this recognition that, we're okay and we're enough simply by dint of the fact that we exist. I always use a way to sort of prove this. There's never a point where you'd look at a baby and be like, no, they're not enough. They need to crack on and adopt that growth mindset. It's fun. It's so obvious. But then, I mean, it's not just a societal thing. Obviously, it's the way the human mind, as it currently is, works. Is this, we start to embed these stories of, oh, I'm not enough. We interpret perhaps rejection or perceived rejection from parents, from school, or sizing up, and then we internalize these stories that we're not enough. But underneath those stories, we are enough and have always been enough. And it's getting through to that insight that's fundamental.
Absolutely. And if you look at young people actually are really interesting, because if you look at young people's joy at just being alive, I mean, even the poorest children, they have this kind of intrinsic joy of just being alive with themselves and their feelings. And I think that as we grow older in modern society, that kind of gets beaten out of us. This kind of almost just joy of existence.
Yeah.
Because And I'm very provocative in my book, perhaps deliberately so, but I'm very clear that this is by design. That our intrinsic nature is to accept and try to find contentment with our existence, but that we are told at all times that we should never stand still, that we have to want and yearn and crave for more, because again it goes back to this idea that this is how the economy. What if we weren't held in this state of needing more? Then you can guarantee that they would have catastrophic consequences at a societal level, because the destruction of demand would create a recession, businesses would close, jobs would be lost, services would go, and the whole fabric of society as we know it would start to crumble, because we're not consuming and we're not working in sufficient measure. And I think our challenge, and I'm really pointed about it, our challenge is to figure out how we can live inside an economy that is a steady state economy. It doesn't have to grow at all times. That where people can feel contented and enough, can land their own planes as well as the economic plane. We can say, okay, we've reached a level of abundance where we're happy with, and now we can stay in this state of relative abundance and live contentedly. That's our challenge. That, for me, in modern society that values its human well-being, that is the core challenge. Because it's so sad to see so many people discontent when
Yeah.
our inner nature is to find inner peace. So
Yeah.
that's my
Yeah.
opinion.
No, absolutely. And I want to come back to that societal piece in a sec. But yeah, that reminds me, I spoke to a guy called Donald Hoffman recently, and he said that he spent time with people who were on their deathbed. And so many of them would say things like, I feel like I've been distracted my whole life, always looking to the future, that horizon you mentioned, as opposed to that simple joy of being that is our innate nature, until we get into, let's say, the system, which starts so early, doesn't it? It starts with school, where we go to school and it's like, okay, you year one, and then you're aiming for year two, and then you're aiming for your 11 plus or whatever it may be, and then your GCSEs to get to your A levels, to get to university, to get your first job, to get your promotion. It's just this never ending, chase. It's so deeply entrenched, isn't it? Now, we'll come back to that, as well as the kind of more personal piece. But just quickly, because we've mentioned children, you had some nice words on parenting, because again, I've gone around to people's houses and seen the poster on the fridge saying, talking about growth mindset, for example, right? But actually, I would imagine that you would say, take that poster down and advocate. Well, you talk specifically about the sort of parenting you advocate. So briefly, can you just talk a little bit to this?
I mean, first of all, I just want to say this is like, I understand why parents push children in this culture and society, because I don't think there's any choice. Uh, if you look out into the world and you're a parent and you want the best for your children, you're going to see a difficult situation. You're going to see an economy that's turning against them. You're going to see house prices that are becoming ever more unaffordable. You're going to see jobs becoming more insecure and poorly paid, particularly at the bottom. And you're going to think, right, the only way my child is going to get ahead in this world is if they get themselves a degree, an advanced degree, and find themselves in a very narrow set of elite professions: finance, law, medicine, and all the rest of it. Because those really are only the only professions right now in this world that's going to guarantee you a level of affluence that's going to essentially allow you a quality of life that everybody says is the good life, right? Car, house, family, yada yada yada. Because at every other stage of the social strata now, it's becoming much more difficult. And we're seeing in the data that, there's downward mobility, cost of living is becoming a much more of a problem, asset prices are high and staying high, even in an inflationary environment with high interest rates. And it seems like if you're looking out into that world, gosh, I'm going to have to push my kids really hard, because otherwise it's going to be really tough for them. So I completely understand it. However, we have to understand also that there's an inadvertent impact that has on young people, because if we keep telling them to do more, and we only praise them when they've done something well and kind of defer praise when they haven't done something well, that teaches them that they're only really worth something in this world when they've achieved. And that, the love and approval and affection is kind of is only granted when there's been some kind of success or some kind of good behavior or good outcome for the child, and otherwise not. And so I think the most important thing for parents to recognize is there has to be an unconditionality of their regard towards children, as to say, no matter what happens, that there's praise, there's love, there's affection, right? When they've done well, don't go overboard. Equally, when they haven't done quite so well, give them support, love, hugs, approval, and tell them, that it's not the end of the world, right? Like, one bad grade is not an indictment on themselves. It doesn't have an impact on how their teacher or you feel about them. And it's one assessment metric of many other types of assessment metric that tell us all sorts of things about, where we are in our academic journey. So it's really, really important to make sure that in everything you do, there's a kind of unconditionality and warmth about parenting, and to focus young people's minds on things that they enjoy too, right? To try and build purpose and value in the kind of gift of learning itself rather than the outcome. So really give young people autonomy if you possibly can on what they study, encourage their passions and desires, their passions in terms of, vocational stuff, or maybe sports, music. These things are really healthy for young people. So yeah, I mean, those are the things I would say, but definitely the unconditionality is such an important piece. It's really important not to make the way we treat young people conditional on how they're performing. But as I say, it's tough. It is tough for parents these days.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as well, there's a power in vulnerability, in showing your kids that actually, you're vulnerable as well, and that you're prone to these sort of up and downs, to normalize them, rather than, as we said earlier, this kind of expectation that you should always have this specific, hey, I'm doing great mindset. No, things do bob and weave. Right. Let's just talk then about the two strands, the do-it-yourself strand. So you're a big exponent, as I am, about self-acceptance. So can you just talk a little bit about this? And I read somewhere as well that you said, accepting ourselves as good enough is key, but you said it's one thing to say it, another to believe it. So can you just talk about self-acceptance and its challenges?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm trying to be pragmatic with the book. I'm trying to be realistic. And what I'm trying to say is that this isn't something there's no quick fix, right? Like, there's no life hack that I could tell a perfectionist right now on this podcast that they do X and they'll feel instantly better. Self-acceptance as a broad philosophy is a journey with no particular endpoint. There's no one person in the entire world is completely accepting of themselves and has this kind of non-perfectionistic mindset. I think at some level we will always harbor some doubts, and in some cases that's kind of natural to do so. But what's really important is to embark on the journey nonetheless. To say, I am going to push myself out there into the world, knowing it's going to be terrifying at first, knowing there's going to be filled with trepidation and fear, but doing it anyway, and taking small steps in the right direction. So if you, for instance, are a very you fear doing things like public speaking, well, put your hand up to do a little talk at work, maybe do a presentation, okay, maybe in front of just your team, and go through the fear that will instill, but do it anyway. Again, if you feel like writing is not your strength, or put your hand up to lead on the writing of a report or project. Or if you're at school or university and you're working in a group project, put your hand up to do the writing. Again, that's going to feel really uncomfortable at first, but it's about pushing yourself out of your comfort zone. And if you can continue to do that and make a pledge to yourself to do that a little bit more every day, to push yourself out in the world, to show your real self to the world, a little by little by little, then you will find that perfectionism and perfectionistic thoughts and feelings start to lose their power over you, little by little by little. And the other thing I would say is, as you embark on that journey, you're going to encounter a lot of setbacks, you're going to encounter a lot of failures, you're going to encounter a lot of maybe even criticism from other people that think things didn't go quite so well. So you have to remind yourself at all times to be kind to yourself. Don't go in on yourself. Don't say, how could you be so stupid? Don't punish yourself for putting yourself in that position, but say, I did it. I put myself out there. That was really brave. and it didn't go quite to plan, but that's okay. I'm only human. I'm going to treat myself with kindness. Every time things don't go quite so well, treat yourself with kindness. Self-compassion is so important. So taking little steps out of your comfort zone and making sure that you treat yourself with kindness at all times through that process is really central. And again, this won't heal your perfectionism overnight. Maybe it will never heal it totally at all, but I can tell you from personal experience that what it will do is it will embolden you to go out into the world, to put yourself forward, to put things out there for other people to read, to view, to criticize, maybe even. And you can let those things in and not feel that they're a total catastrophe in terms of your self-worth, that you're almost more resilient to the world and more open to it. So that's what self-acceptance means to me. And as I say in the book, I try to provide some practical steps, but also some kind of philosophical sound bites that I hope it inspire people to take that journey.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing, acceptance and self-acceptance, isn't it? Because you talk about healing or getting rid of the perfectionist streak, right? But that's the whole point of acceptance, isn't it? Is to accept your perfectionism. It's the paradox, isn't it? And when you're, for example, putting yourself into that position, like you said, okay, you're reluctant to get up and do a talk. Okay, put your hand up and do the talk. What you're doing is you're accepting the uncomfortable thoughts and feelings that are going to be part and parcel of that. And this is why when I read your line about, it's one thing to say it, it's another to believe it in terms of acceptance, right? I would just question actually whether or not belief is necessary. It's because, and I'm just going to use a bit of an example. Like if I think of my cats, right? My
Mhm.
cats have impeccably high standards. They groom themselves like you wouldn't believe, fastidious with the cat litter tray, like really impressive, okay? But there's no way that they're perfectionists. And so this idea that I think that we need to believe something, again, it comes back to that kind of mindset, because belief, what is a belief? It's just a hardened thought. Thoughts chop and change.
Mhm.
Actually, it's just noticing kind of what's going on, allowing it to be there without resisting it. So without resisting, oh, I shouldn't be feeling this perfectionist tendency, or identifying it with it. Oh, this is me. No,
Mhm.
all it is like I mean, you talk about how it's inherited to a big degree from your mother, the role of genetics and all that kind of thing. It predates us so much, right? So it's part of our, let's say, our makeup in terms of our mind, but it's almost like that mindfulness thing of just noticing it, being aware of it, not identifying, not resisting it, allowing it to be. And in doing so, you're not seeking to unwind it, right? You're just seeking to notice it and allow it to be there. But in doing that, a side effect, which isn't the goal, but is a side effect, is that naturally it will tend to unwind a bit. Does that resonate?
100%. I think you're absolutely right to push back on me a little bit there, because what you're saying is very, very true. I think I think this is also the piece about where the interaction comes with society, because right now those things to just to let it be
Mm,
is crucial, but really tough, because there's so many pressures that push on us
yeah,
to
yeah,
accentuate it, amplify it, use it in a way that will maximize, that will, you know, get us ahead and
yeah, of course.
self improve or better ourselves or whatever. So this is where the kind of societal stuff comes in, because you're absolutely right. There is that kind of serenity and that inner peace that's needed to just live and exist and let things, thoughts, feelings, behaviors, just let them, be. Don't try to push them, don't try to squash them. But at the same time, we also need to be helped out by our society. It allows us to
Mm,
do that, allows us to live in a world where we can do those things without consequence. And I think that's our challenge, really. If we if we can get that right, I think we will be a lot happier.
yeah,
But at the moment, it's tough because we're
of
pushed
course.
in so many directions.
100%. I think it's that combination, isn't it, between getting the personal right and then the societal right. And I mean, you give a lovely example in terms of some of your. I know you spent some time with some students in Italy, and obviously they're still barraged by all the usual stuff. But I love it. You're like the consumerism doesn't get in the way of good wine and good food. And I was like, God, they are bang on in Italy. But it is like this. It's this unchecked growth, right? That is embedded in society and in the way the whole world is living, isn't it? The kind of neoliberal consumerism type stuff, this kind of growth at all costs. And when I say at all costs, at the cost of the planet, at the cost of employees, it's really just about that bottom line. And I've heard, compare that growth at all costs mentality that is so endemic. It's like cancer in that eventually, it can destroy the host. And you sort of argue that that's in many ways where we're headed. So yeah, from a societal point of view, what's your take on it? I mean, you talk about steady state economy, which is fantastic, and prioritizing well-being, but yeah, what's your
I, well, this is the most provocative part of the book, and I know it's going to be one that will not be overly well received with certain audiences, and I'm prepared for that because
can I just chip in very quickly, Tom? I would
yeah.
say I think most people will absolutely resonate in my biased view will absolutely resonate with what you had to say here. So
Well, I appreciate that, Simon, because I think one of the things where, I was told in the editorial process that, this just be, you got to be careful. Like it's people want a nice self-help, book about what we can do and all the rest of it. And that was never really like, what I couldn't do is say to people, here's a lot of societal issues that are driving our perfectionism. Here's what you as individuals can do to overcome them. I wanted to follow the societal problems through to their logical conclusion, which is societal solutions. That doesn't mean there aren't things that we can do within ourselves to help to overcome perfectionism, but we have a collective responsibility, I think, to recognize that these are shared tensions, and that as shared tensions require shared solutions, collective solutions. So for me, the biggest thing is, as you mentioned, our addiction to growth at all costs. And I think if we can somehow find a way, and there are many, many way more skilled economists than I am wrestling with this idea of how we create steady state growth. And how we exist as an economy, in a state of good enough, abundant enough. These are things that are ongoing, and I think we should pay attention to. Prioritizing well-being over GDP, I think that's hugely important. What good is 2% GDP if more people are going to hospital, more people are committing suicide, more people are addicted to drugs on our streets? Like, what good is this economic growth if it's not impacting people? I've talked about universal basic income, which is being tried in the UK. I think that could put a floor under desperation and poverty, which I think is really, really important. And just bringing inequality into where it was in the sort of 60s and 70s wouldn't also be a bad idea either. I think all these things go some way to help. I'm not a political analyst, I'm not an economist, but all these things are just ideas. These things are just things that, I want people to understand and see that there are solutions out there. There are things we can think about doing. I'm not saying we should do them. I'm just saying that this is kind of like a thought experiment of sorts as to what would perfectionism look like in a society that did these things or prioritized different things. And to my mind, it would lose most of its power over us.
Yeah.
So that's really why I wanted to finish the book there, and I'm glad you enjoyed it. I always like going to Europe because the Europeans just seem to have a little bit of a more balanced.
They get it, right?
They kind of get it.
Certainly the Italians. But listen, kind of just to finish, it's interesting. You talk there about the 70s, and so much of the media in particular look back on the bad 70s. But actually, that was a time when inequality was at its lowest, which I found really interesting. And inequality is obviously this huge problem. And just when you said as well about during the editorial process, be careful, people want, this kind of self-help book, how to get ahead kind of thing. There's that Wayne Gretzky quote, which I heard Alistair Campbell use recently, which is like, I don't go to where the puck is, I go to where the puck is going. Yeah. And for me, Tom, I think you're absolutely bang on. I think what you've written about and some of the answers, whether it be in terms of acceptance or societal and steady state, is exactly where the puck is going. So, and you want to be ahead of the curve or ahead of the wave than on top of it or behind it. And I absolutely think you are. And if I had to sum it up, for me, it's like, as you say in the book, the power of good enough personally and in terms of the way we live our lives. So listen, I think it's absolutely bang on. I congratulate you on your work. I think it's a really important message for this exact juncture in time. So listen, I think you've nailed it, mate. Congratulations.
Thank you, Simon. I really appreciate it. That was a great chat.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Life Lessons podcast. I would be delighted to hear your thoughts, your ideas, your guest suggestions, your questions. Just get in touch via my website, simonmundie.com. And if you could share this episode with someone you know or on social media, I would be very grateful, as it does really help people to find this podcast. That's it for now. I will be back with a bite-sized episode this Friday and another full-length episode next week. Until then, goodbye.